The morning air in Harmony Gulch was thin and sharp, carrying the distant, sterile scent of pine mixed with the immediate visceral smell of old dust and freshly crushed regret. Elias, a boy nearing his 12th year, stood rigid on the narrow porch, his bare feet curled against the cool, rough grain of the cedar planks. The wood was familiar, worn smooth by generations of feet, mostly his grandmother Mabel's, and now soon it would belong to a stranger. The source of the imminent change stood only 10 feet away, planted firmly on the hard-packed earth where the gravel track met the front yard. Mr. Silas Thorne. Thorne was a silhouette of sharp angles against the rising sun, clad in a charcoal suit that seemed impossibly dense and wrinkle-free for the dusty environment. His expensive Italian leather loafers, polished to a mirror sheen, crunched purposefully against the fine white pebbles of the driveway. Elias fixated on those shoes, heavy, expensive, and entirely out of place. They were the physical embodiment of the invasive force that had arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, heralded by the aggressive, unnecessary horn blast of a black Cadillac Escalade, now idling silently like a predator holding its breath. The sound of the idling engine was a low, insistent thrum that vibrated through the foundation and up into Elias's sternum, matching the anxious tremor already residing there. Thorne did not look at Elias directly. He was too busy surveying the property with a sweeping, proprietary glance that measured acreage and potential profit, not history or heartbreak. He held a thick manila envelope, the color of dried bone, pressed tight against his thigh. The edges of the paper were crisp and unforgiving. 8 o'clock, boy, Thorne announced, his voice carrying a manufactured resonance, the kind used to address shareholders or unresponsive court officials, never a grieving child. The sheriff confirmed the timeline. You have until noon to vacate the premises. The contents must be moved, or they will be tagged and placed in temporary storage at your expense. Elias swallowed, a dry, painful constriction in his throat. He had already packed the essentials. Mabel's woolen shawl, the photograph of his parents, the worn copy of The Secret Garden. But packing a life was not the same as dismantling a home. The very air smelled of Mabel, a faint trace of vanilla and aged lavender soap clinging to the fabric of the porch curtains, stirred gently by the morning breeze. The papers, Elias managed, his voice thin and reedy, startling even himself with its vulnerability. They said this was Granddad's land. He built this house. Thorne finally lowered his gaze, not to Elias's eyes, but to the area just above his head, the universal mark of someone speaking down to a subordinate. Your grandfather, God rest his soul, held a claim that expired 3 decades ago due to delinquent municipal taxes, young man. We went over this in the preliminary hearing. Thorne clipped the words, each one a tiny, precise stab. The estate sale was finalized a month prior to your grandmother's passing. I bought the deed, free and clear, from the county itself. The only thing standing between me and my development project is the structural integrity of this shack, and you, standing on the porch. Thorne took 2 steps forward, crossing the threshold from the gravel drive to the yard, stopping precisely where the grass, brown and patchy from lack of rain, ended and the dirt began. His polished loafers were now centered on a small, ancient patch of ground near the low front steps, a spot that Mabel used to refer to as the welcome mat, but which was nothing more than sun-baked clay, laced with tenacious sprigs of resilient weeds. Elias's chest tightened. He gripped the wooden railing so hard that splinters threatened to pierce his skin. The raw, desperate urgency of the situation was finally crystallizing, moving beyond abstract legal jargon into the tangible threat of homelessness. Where would he go? He had no other family, only the distant, impersonal gaze of the state social worker who had already informed him that temporary housing meant a sterile, crowded facility 50 miles away. He needed to buy time. He needed to think. I need to get her things, Elias whispered. trying to sound compliant, weak. He needed Thorne to underestimate him. Thorne consulted a heavy, ornate wristwatch, the metal gleaming coldly. "You have 3 hours, 17 minutes. I will wait here. I need to assess the structural integrity of the foundation before the bulldozers arrive at 1. The word bulldozers landed with the weight of granite. Elias felt a wave of dizziness. He pivoted swiftly, retreating into the dim, cool interior of the cabin, the heavy wooden door closing with a gentle, controlled thud that barely masked the frantic beating of his own heart. Inside, the light was muted, filtered through the grime of old glass and the thick overhang of the porch roof. The cabin was tiny, just one main room serving as living space and kitchen, and a small partitioned alcove that had been Mabel's bedroom. The air here was heavy with memory, dense and protective. Elias walked slowly to the center of the main room. His eyes swept over the floorboards. They were dark oak, deeply scored, creaking under every step. He knew every groove, every knot, every whisper of these planks. They had been laid by his great-grandfather a century ago. He bent down beside the hearth, where the old cast-iron stove sat cold and silent. This spot, immediately adjacent to the stone hearth, was the most sacred ground in the entire cabin. Mabel had kept it immaculate, not just clean, but polished. She had a strange, almost obsessive ritual of dusting this specific section of floor every Sunday morning, even after she grew too frail to clean the rest of the house properly. Elias knelt. He ran his hand over the worn wood. The boards here were slightly darker, almost black, near the stove's base. They met the small, raised stone apron of the hearth. He remembered a moment, 6 months prior, just weeks before Mabel had been rushed to the hospital. She was frail, her hands trembling, but she was kneeling right here, gripping a small, brittle brush, scrubbing the space between the last floorboard and the edge of the hearthstone. "Never forget, Ellie," she had rasped, her voice thin as tissue paper. "The foundation is everything. The foundation protects what's truly yours." Elias hadn't understood. He thought she was talking about integrity or moral character, the kind of things grandmothers preached. But now, with the sound of Silas Thorne's heavy breathing and the impatient shifting of his expensive shoes vibrating just outside, the words took on a new, urgent dimension. The foundation protects what's truly yours. He pressed his fingers against the seam where the dark oak plank met the stone. Most of the seams were filled with centuries of dust and grit, but this one had been cleaned out meticulously. It wasn't just a seam, it was a hairline gap. He applied gentle pressure to the surface of the floorboard. It didn't budge. He tried the next one, solid. He returned to the dark plank closest to the hearth. He pushed harder, testing the resistance. The board gave, infinitesimally, shifting perhaps a millimeter down, and then snapping back. It was not nailed properly. It was hinged, or maybe just set loose. Elias's heart surged, a painful, frantic drumming in his ears. This was it, a secret. He needed a tool. He glanced around the sparse room. His gaze landed on the kitchen counter, dusty now, where a single old-fashioned butter knife lay among a pile of forgotten silverware. It had a dull, rounded tip, perfect for prying without leaving obvious scratch marks. He scurried across the floor, his movements silent, fueled by adrenaline. He snatched the knife, the brass handle cold in his hand. Back at the hearth, he inserted the rounded tip of the knife into the minute crack. He wiggled it gently, fearing the sound of splintering wood that might carry through the thin walls to Thorne outside. The knife caught. He used his thumb as a fulcrum and applied upward pressure. The wood groaned, a deep, satisfied sound of release, and the 12-inch section of dark oak floorboard lifted slightly. Elias froze, listening intently. Outside, Thorne cleared his throat, a loud, impatient sound, followed by the specific, heavy crunch of his shoe shifting position on the ground immediately outside the window. Elias let the floorboard fall back into place. the soft thunk muffled by the dust. He waited, motionless, for a full minute, allowing his own breathing to slow down. Thorne did not move closer. He seemed content to stand guard. Elias cautiously lifted the board again. It came up easily this time, revealing a shallow cavity, perhaps 4 inches deep, hollowed out of the dirt and subfloor beneath. The air that wafted up was cool, dry, and carried the specific, musty scent of very old paper. Inside the cavity lay a single object, wrapped in a tightly sealed parcel of dark, heavy oilskin, tied with coarse, ancient twine. The package was roughly the size of a standard legal document. Folded into quarters, it looked not just old, but preserved. Elias's hands trembled violently as he reached in. The oilskin was slick and cool against his fingertips. He pulled it out, resting the loose floorboard gently beside the cavity. He was still kneeling, hidden partially by the shadow of the cold stove. He needed light, but he couldn't move toward the window. He carefully began unwrapping the twine. It was knotted intricately, designed for longevity, not easy access. He used the dull butter knife to carefully cut the twine, sawing slowly, deliberately, until the knot gave way with a soft snap. He pulled the twine away, revealing the stiff, dark material of the oilskin. He unfolded the outer layer. The smell intensified. Not decay, but the specific, dry, chemical scent of aged paper and sealing wax. Beneath the oilskin lay a document, folded neatly. It was not pristine white, but a deep, creamy parchment color, brittle and thin, crisscrossed with delicate, almost invisible creases. Elias hesitated, holding the document, its potential power thrumming in his hands. He couldn't read the whole thing now. He needed to know the central truth. He unfolded it once, then a second time, until the full sheet was revealed. It was large, covering his crossed knees entirely. The ink was faded, brown and sprawling, written in a flourishing hand that spoke of a bygone era. At the very top, large, bold script dominated the page. Elias strained his eyes to read the archaic lettering: Certified Land Grant and Heirloom Deed. His heart seized. This wasn't a modern deed. This was something ancient. He scanned the text, his eyes racing, struggling to decipher the dense legal language and the elaborate cursive. He focused on names and dates. To the perpetual heirs of the family McFarland, commencing with Tobias McFarland, who did, in the year of our Lord 1888, establish and build upon this plot designated as Harmon Tract Section 4, the property hereby described as Elias knew his grandfather's name was McFarland. Tobias was the founding ancestor. This was the original document, predating the modern county records that Thorne had purchased his clean deed from. But modern law superseded old grants, didn't it? Elias searched for the critical element. He looked for the seal. The lower right corner held not one, but 3 distinct seals, pressed deep into thick, blood-red wax. One bore the insignia of the State Land Office. The others were too smeared to identify, but they spoke of official, undeniable authority. And then he saw it, lower down, near the bottom, written in a clear though smaller hand. This grant is recorded as an unalienable familial endowment, exempt from standard municipal taxation levies, provided the direct heirs maintain residence upon the tract for no less than 9 consecutive months per annum. This clause is certified by the governor's signature, affixed 1891. Elias stared at the words, specifically the term, exempt from standard municipal taxation levies. The whole premise of Thorne's purchase, the delinquent taxes that had supposedly caused the forfeiture, was built upon a lie, or at least an ignorance of this ancient exemption. The county had sold land it never fully owned, believing the tax debt was valid. The shock was physical, a cold wave washing over his terror. He was holding not just a piece of paper, but the actual, binding history of his family's rightful ownership. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin. He needed to verify this immediately, but he couldn't leave the cabin, not with Thorne waiting outside. He had to hide the evidence and formulate a plan. He heard the creak of the porch railing. Thorne was leaning against it now, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Boy, noon is approaching swiftly," Thorne barked, his voice rising in volume, carrying the edge of threat. "Do not think you can stall. The clock is ticking." Elias quickly refolded the parchment, wrapped it tightly in the oilskin, and with agonizing care slipped it back into the cavity. He replaced the loose floorboard, gently nudging it until it sat perfectly flush. He even sprinkled a few grains of dust back over the seam, hoping to obscure the recent disturbance. He rose slowly, his legs cramped from kneeling. He felt a profound, almost dizzying shift in his internal landscape. The helpless, vulnerable boy had been replaced by something quieter, steelier. He was still frightened, but the fear was now overlaid with a cold, clear determination. He had to get this document to the one person he knew still respected the letter of the law in this small county, Judge Davies, who had presided over the preliminary hearing. Elias walked out of the cabin, the sun hitting his eyes, temporarily blinding him to the menace of Thorne. He stopped on the threshold, facing the man who was now standing, arms crossed, directly over the hiding spot. Thorne's expensive shoe was still planted firmly on the patch of dry earth near the front steps, the metaphorical deed buried inches below the leather sole. "Finished with your sentimental goodbyes?" Thorne asked, sarcasm dripping from the words. "Almost," Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I need my things, my personal items. I need to take the box down to the county road." This was the next phase of the plan, getting away from the property without raising alarm. Thorne couldn't see the document, and he couldn't know Elias was leaving permanently, not for the county road, but for the courthouse 10 miles distant. "Fine, one trip," Thorne conceded, waving a dismissive hand. "Don't dawdle." Elias went back inside, grabbing the single, worn cardboard box he had packed the day before. It contained Mabel's shawl, the photo, and a small, worn leather satchel that contained his birth certificate and $11 he had saved from odd jobs. He carried the box out, setting it down with a heavy thud on the porch. He then deliberately returned inside and retrieved a shovel and a trowel, rusty, ordinary gardening implements. Thorne eyed the tools with suspicion. "What are those for? You planning on burying your treasures?" "No, sir," Elias replied, keeping his expression neutral. "Mabel had a small rose bush she loved out by the road. She always said I should dig it up and take it if I ever moved. It's important to me." Thorne scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically, clearly viewing the request as sentimental idiocy, but ultimately harmless. "Hurry up! The clock is running. I'm not paying for the time the county charges me for this delay." Elias picked up the shovel, the cool metal familiar in his sweaty hands. He walked past Thorne, feeling the man's cold gaze tracking his movement. He walked down the gravel path, trying to look defeated, moving slowly, shoulders slumped. He reached the edge of the property, where a sprawling, wild tangle of dog roses marked the boundary with the public road. He knelt, planting the tools nearby, and began to work the earth around the thorny roots of the rosebush. But he wasn't really digging. He was watching Thorne. Thorne was distracted. He had pulled out a cell phone, a sleek, dark slab of technology, and was pacing near the front steps, speaking in low, impatient tones to someone about foundation measurements and concrete scheduling. This was his chance. Elias gripped the shovel, and with a sudden surge of physical effort, he drove the blade deep into the earth beside the rosebush, tearing up a large, heavy clod of dirt. He repeated the action, building a small, deceptive mound of soil. He then casually bent down, retrieving the small satchel from his box. He paused, ensuring Thorne was still occupied with his call, his back partially turned as he gestured impatiently toward the dilapidated front door. Elias knew he couldn't leave the deed buried in the cabin. If Thorne found it during demolition, or if the county intervened and seized the contents, it would be gone forever. He needed to carry it on him, hidden, until he reached the courthouse. He rose, placing the satchel over his shoulder. He made a show of patting down the disturbed earth around the rosebush. "Be right back," he mumbled loud enough for Thorne to hear, then began walking down the dusty road, away from the cabin. "Where are you going now?" Thorne demanded, ending his call abruptly, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "To find a better container for the roots," Elias lied smoothly, pointing vaguely toward the sparse line of trees a quarter-mile down the road. "I don't want them to dry out. I'll be quick." Thorne scowled, the gesture pulling the expensive fabric of his suit tight across his shoulders. "You have exactly 5 minutes. If you exceed that, I'm locking the doors and having the remaining contents inventoried." Elias nodded, feigning desperation. He walked quickly, his heart hammering against his ribs, not toward the trees, but toward the relative cover of a large, dense thicket of chokecherry bushes about 50 feet further down the road. Once out of Thorne's immediate field of vision, though still visible if the man truly looked, Elias dropped the box and the tools. He tore open the satchel, pushing the few crumpled bills and his papers aside. He began running back toward the cabin, sticking to the edge of the road, keeping his body low and fast. He had less than a minute. Thorne was still preoccupied, examining the underside of the porch rail, where the wood met the foundation. He was leaning over, checking for rot or structural weaknesses. His back was entirely to Elias, and his expensive, shiny shoe was still placed exactly on the spot, the small patch of dirt, just shy of the front steps above the hidden deed. Elias reached the area near the front steps, moving with the unnatural quietness born of fear and adrenaline. He knelt down rapidly, not on the porch, but in the dry dirt beside the steps, pretending to be searching for a lost object. He reached under the bottom step, pulling out the small, rusty trowel he had retrieved earlier. It was thin and weak, but effective. He then moved, not onto the porch, but right up to the patch of ground where Thorne was standing. Thorne, oblivious, shifted his weight slightly, balancing on his left leg as he leaned to inspect the railing. His right shoe was planted precisely above the buried deed. Elias pushed the handle of the trowel into the dirt, right at the base of Thorne's polished right shoe, acting as if he were trying to scrape away a clump of mud. The sound of metal scraping against the dry clay was sharp but brief. Thorne didn't even flinch. He was too focused on the rot. "Get away from my feet, boy!" Thorne snapped, still without looking up. "Sorry, sir. Just checking if I lost something," Elias muttered, pulling the trowel back quickly. The small act had been enough. Elias, using the trowel, had loosened the dry clay just enough to reveal the slight indentation of the loose floorboard below the dirt. He didn't need to dig under Thorne's foot. He needed to access the cavity from the cabin side. The real danger lay in retrieving it while Thorne was standing on the precise spot. Elias stood up, moving away from Thorne's shadow, and returned to the porch. He sat heavily on the lowest step, feigning exhaustion and despair. "I can't find anything," he sighed dramatically, resting his head in his hands. He kept his hands over his eyes, but his focus was entirely on Thorne's shoes. Thorne straightened up, flexing his back. He took a heavy step toward the cabin door, turning slightly. This movement shifted his expensive shoes off the critical spot, moving him onto the porch. Now, Elias shot forward back into the cabin in one fluid motion. Thorne, focused on the lock on the door, didn't notice the speed or the intent. Inside, Elias dropped to his knees at the hearth. He felt for the loose floorboard, found the edge, and used the tip of the dull butter knife to pry it open. He didn't waste time looking this time. His hand dove into the cavity, finding the smooth, heavy oilskin. He pulled the parcel out, replaced the floorboard, and smoothed the dust over the seam. The whole operation took less than 5 seconds. He stood up, the oilskin bundle held tight in his left hand, hidden against the dark fabric of his worn denim shirt. He walked back out onto the porch. Thorne was already at the door, pulling a small silver padlock from his pocket. "Time's up, McFarland," Thorne announced, his voice cold and final. "Anything you haven't moved is county property now." "I understand," Elias said, trying to modulate the wild, frantic pounding of his heart. The oilskin was slick with sweat in his palm. It felt like a ticking bomb. He walked past Thorne, down the steps, and back toward the road where he had left his satchel. He was walking away from his home, the smell of pine and dust and Mabel's lavender washing over him one last time. He reached the chokecherry bushes, retrieved his satchel, and quickly shoved the oilskin document deep inside, beneath his clothing and papers. It was bulky and uncomfortable, but secure. He then picked up the tools and the empty box, making a show of moving toward the county road, away from the cabin. "Where is that container for the rose?" Thorne called out, standing on the porch, hands resting on his hips in a posture of satisfied ownership. "I decided I'll just hold them in the dirt until I find a better spot," Elias lied, his voice barely wavering. He started walking down the county road. The road was gravel, leading 10 miles to the small town of Harmony, where the courthouse was located. He couldn't risk the main highway, where Thorne or his associates might spot him hitchhiking. He walked, the sun climbing higher, beating down on the dusty road. Every crunch of gravel under his worn sneakers was a step further from the only home he had ever known, but a step closer to vindication. The satchel was heavy, the rolled parchment digging into his side. He walked for an hour, the adrenaline slowly giving way to crushing exhaustion. He focused on the details, the heat radiating off the gravel, the buzzing of cicadas in the pines, the dry, irritating dust kicked up by his own feet. He was hungry, dehydrated, but the fear of losing the house spurred him forward. He finally reached the outskirts of Harmony, the first sign being the sound of distant traffic and the sudden, strong smell of hot asphalt and diesel fumes. The courthouse was an old, stately building of grey stone, its facade marked by thick, Roman columns and steps worn smooth by a century of worried petitioners and confident lawyers. Elias walked straight inside, ignoring the curious glances from the few people milling about. He walked past the main reception, following the faded directions written on a wall plaque to the clerk of records office. The office was a maze of tall, steel filing cabinets and desks piled high with yellowish paper. A middle-aged woman named Mrs. Peterson, whom Elias vaguely remembered from Mabel's occasional visits, sat behind a large, cluttered desk, chewing slowly on the end of a pencil. "May I help you, young man?" she asked, her voice weary. Elias pulled the satchel off his shoulder, his hands trembling again now that the journey was over. The physical manifestation of urgency was replaced by the anxiety of the imminent confrontation. "I need to see Judge Davies," Elias said, trying to sound older, more authoritative than an 11-year-old on the brink of tears. "It's urgent, about the McFarland property, the land sale." Mrs. Peterson sighed, dropping the pencil. "The judge is in chambers, dear, and he won't be bothered about that matter. It's closed. Mr. Thorne holds the legal deed, free and clear." "No, he doesn't," Elias insisted, stepping closer, his voice rising, edged with desperation. "He bought the wrong deed, the real one, the original land grant. It's exempt from taxes. It was never forfeited." Mrs. Peterson's face softened slightly, recognizing the distress, but remaining skeptical. "Son, those old land grants were all superseded by the 1950s tax reform acts. It's just history now." "Not this one," Elias countered, pulling the oilskin parcel out of his satchel. It was heavy, undeniable. "My grandmother kept this hidden. Please, just tell the judge. It's about the McFarland land grant, and that I brought the original document." The sight of the oilskin, so old, so specific, gave Mrs. Peterson pause. She picked up the intercom receiver, her eyes fixed on the heavy package. "Judge Davies, I apologize for the interruption. There's a young man here, Elias McFarland. He claims to have the original land grant for the property Mr. Thorne purchased. He seems very distressed." There was a muffled, distant noise through the speaker. Mrs. Peterson listened, nodded, and replaced the receiver. "The judge will give you 3 minutes. Go right through the back door." Elias walked toward the dark oak door Mrs. Peterson indicated, his legs feeling like lead weights. Judge Davies' chambers were spacious, cool, and smelled of leather and old paper, a contrast to the dust and heat outside. The judge, a man with kind, tired eyes and a neatly trimmed grey beard, sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, stacking files. "Elias," the judge said gently, "I'm sorry about your grandmother. I truly am. But I cannot reverse a legally finalized sale. Mr. Thorne holds the deed of trust issued by the county." Elias approached the desk, the parchment document still wrapped tightly in oilskin. "Judge, I know you follow the law," Elias began, his voice surprisingly firm. He laid the parcel onto the polished wood of the desk. "This is the law, the real law, for that land." He unwrapped the oilskin slowly, carefully folding back the protective layer. He then unfurled the thick yellowed parchment. The sound of the paper crackling filled the silent chamber. Judge Davies adjusted his spectacles, his expression shifting from courteous dismissal to immediate, stunned attention. "Good heavens," the judge whispered, leaning forward, his gaze fixed on the sprawling 19th-century script and the thick, red wax seals. "Where did you find this?" "Mabel hid it," Elias explained, pointing to the line about the tax exemption, "right under the floorboards by the hearth. The very spot Mr. Thorne was standing on this morning, waiting for me to leave." The judge reached out a slow, careful hand and touched the document. He traced the lines of the exemption clause, reading it meticulously, his lips moving silently. "An unalienable familial endowment, exempt from standard levies," he murmured, shaking his head. "I thought this particular clause was unique to the railroad tracks, not residential land. The county clerk must have missed this exemption during the original title search decades ago. Or perhaps it was filed so far back it was only in the state archives, not local records." The judge sat back, the leather of his chair groaning softly. The intensity of the document seemed to fill the room. "Elias," the judge said, his voice now entirely serious, devoid of previous pity, "if this document is proven authentic, dated and sealed correctly, it nullifies Mr. Thorne's entire transaction. If the land was legally exempt from taxation, the county never had the right to seize and sell it for delinquent taxes." Elias felt a faint spark of hope ignite, fragile but intense. "Is it real?" Elias pleaded. The judge picked up the phone. "I need to call the State Archives office immediately, and I need a notary public in my chambers, now." The next hour was a blur of frantic, controlled activity. Judge Davies, energized by the unexpected gravity of the situation, worked the phones, his voice sharp and demanding. The notary public, a stern woman named Ms. Lindstrom, arrived and examined the seals, comparing them to reference charts for the 1890s. The state archivist confirmed via a secure video call that the format, seal types, and specific wording matched a known, rare series of post-Civil War familial land grants, often issued in areas considered too remote for immediate county infrastructure support. Finally, Judge Davies placed the heavy receiver back in its cradle, a look of profound resolution on his face. "Elias, this is legitimate," he announced. "The McFarland family home and land, Harmon Tract Section 4, was never legally county property to sell. This deed, your deed, is binding. It supersedes the modern paperwork entirely." Elias felt a huge, crushing weight lift from his chest, replaced by a sudden, dizzying lightness. He had done it. Mabel had saved them. "What about Mr. Thorne?" Elias asked, the urgency returning. "He's there now. He's going to demolish the cabin at 1 o'clock. The judge glanced at his clock. 12:37. "We move immediately," the judge declared, rising abruptly. "Ms. Lindstrom, prepare an emergency restraining order and nullification affidavit, citing this primary source document. I will drive Elias back to the property and serve the order myself. We have to beat that bulldozer." The trip back to Harmony Gulch was silent, the judge driving his dark sedan with focused speed. The nullification affidavit, freshly stamped and signed, rested on the dashboard. Elias clutched the oilskin document tightly on his lap. As they neared the familiar gravel track, Elias could already see the difference. The quiet solitude was gone. A massive yellow bulldozer, its engine roaring, sat parked near the cabin, waiting. And standing exactly where he had been before, surrounded now by two large, intimidating men in construction vests, was Silas Thorne. Thorne was conferring with the bulldozer operator, gesturing aggressively toward the small cabin. The judge braked sharply, spraying gravel as they turned onto the track. The sudden noise drew all three men's attention. Thorne squinted at the approaching vehicle, his expression shifting from annoyance to cold recognition of the judge's distinct sedan. The judge stepped out, slamming the car door shut. Elias followed, staying close to the judge's side, clutching the document. "Thorne, halt all activity immediately!" the judge called out, his voice strong and authoritative, cutting through the heavy diesel fumes. Thorne walked forward, radiating expensive outrage. "Judge Davies, what is the meaning of this intrusion? This is private property, my property. I have the signed deed and the court order. I am operating within my rights." "No, Mr. Thorne," the judge retorted, pulling the freshly stamped nullification affidavit from his coat pocket, holding it out like a shield. "You are trespassing, and I am operating within my rights to serve you this emergency restraining order. Your deed is null and void." Thorne stopped dead, his face draining of color. He stared at the blue seal on the paper. Null and void? What utter nonsense is this? Based on what authority? "Based on the authority of this," the judge said, stepping aside and indicating Elias. Elias, despite the terrifying proximity of the huge man, took a brave step forward and held up the antique parchment. The sun caught the faint crimson gleam of the wax seals. "This is the McFarland Land Grant, certified 1891, Elias stated, his voice ringing with a newfound certainty. "It exempts this land from taxes. The county never owned it. You bought nothing." Thorne's eyes flickered from Elias's young, determined face to the ancient, undeniable parchment. His cold composure shattered. "That's a forgery," Thorne roared, taking a threatening step toward Elias. "That's a ridiculous piece of junk. I bought a clean deed from the county, endorsed by the state." "Mr. Thorne, this document has been verified by the state archivist," the judge interjected sharply, stepping between Thorne and Elias. "The 1891 land grant is primary source documentation that precedes and supersedes your modern deed. The land remains the unalienable property of the McFarland family heirs, specifically Elias." The weight of the parchment in Elias's hands felt monumental. The silence was thick, broken only by the aggressive idle of the bulldozer's engine. Thorne stared at the ground. He looked down at his expensive, highly polished shoes, standing precisely where the real, valid deed had been buried for a century, hidden only inches beneath the soles of the very objects he believed represented his undisputed ownership. The irony was devastatingly visible on his face, a slow, painful realization that his arrogance and impatience had caused him to overlook the obvious. He had been standing guard over the very proof that destroyed his claim. The two construction workers, sensing the profound shift in authority, began to retreat toward their vehicles, the bulldozer operator shutting off the massive engine. Thorne let out a ragged breath, the sound of a man watching a multi-million-dollar investment evaporate into dust. "You have 20 minutes, Mr. Thorne, to remove your vehicles and any personal effects. If you return to this property, I will issue a contempt charge. You will pursue your litigation against the county, not against this boy." The judge's tone was final. Silas Thorne, a man used to dominance, stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the cabin, Elias's cabin. Then, slowly, painfully, he turned and walked toward his Cadillac, his expensive shoes crushing the very gravel he thought he owned. He did not look back. The victory was quiet, profound, and utterly exhausting. The judge turned to Elias, placing a large, warm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Elias, you saved your home. Your grandmother ensured you had the strength and the knowledge to protect your foundation." Tears, which Elias had stubbornly held back through the entire ordeal, finally streamed down his dusty cheeks. They were not tears of fear or desperation, but of immense, overwhelming relief and gratitude. He looked at the cabin, his small, dusty, imperfect home, now safe. He carefully re-rolled the parchment, tucking it securely into his satchel. It was no longer just an old document. It was the foundation of his future. He walked up the small, creaking steps, placed his foot on the familiar cedar plank, and stepped inside the doorway, breathing in the scent of Mabel's lavender, knowing with absolute certainty that he was finally, truly home. The sun was high, and the danger had passed. The rhythm of life in Harmony Gulch was his again.